We're back again with our Creality Ender 3 version 2. Today we're going to take a little deeper dive into the firmware. Hello everyone, Chris here, and yes, I've been doing a little work on my Creality Ender 3 version 2. In the last video we added a BL touch sensor to make sure that our first layer goes down as consistently as possible. But now I want to do just a little bit deeper dive into the firmware. There's a lot of great reasons why you should update the firmware on your 3D printer, but especially on a lower cost machine like the Ender 3, you want to make sure that all of the safety features you need are enabled. Some of these stock don't come with that, and using something like straight up Marlin or RepRap, you can be ensured that all of those safety features will be there. Plus, there's a lot of features that aren't enabled on a stock machine that are available in Marlin. Some of those will make your print more consistent, or enable you to print just a little bit faster. And with having that full source code after you've compiled it, you can go back and tweak it however you see fit whenever you want, and then reload it to your machine. So it's a win-win all around. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to compile Marlin for our Ender 3 V2, get it uploaded, and see how it works with the little fancier screen that you get on the version 2. So let's jump over to the computer. And just to pick up where we left off, this is our existing firmware version that we did in the last video. You can check it out here. In Control Info, we're on Marlin 2085, which isn't a bad version, but there's more current versions to be had. Again, we got that version from the Creality site, their Ender 3 V2 download page. That's this version right here. There's a couple different versions contained in this package depending on what you'd like to do with your printer. Add auto bed leveling, filament detection, whatever you want. So that's the one that we used. We have made no changes to the firmware that lives on the screen yet. And we want to load full-blown Marlin on this 3D printer. Now it really doesn't matter which screen you use, which layout you want to go with. You'll see that more as we get into it. We want the newest code so we can use as many of the features as possible. They're all baked into the newest version. So go to marlinfw.org to grab your firmware. You can download it right here. And the easiest way, in my opinion, to set up Marlin is to use an example. All of those are available in GitHub. There's actually a link in the firmware if you'd like to check that out, but GitHub's a pretty easy place to go get it. You just go to the Marlin GitHub, go to config. If you want to use bug fix, you can. You can jump back to the stable release up here, just go to 2.1, and grab this zip file. That's going to be all the example configurations you ever wanted to use. And after you have your download complete, I just like to expand Marlin and then make a brand new Marlin set for whatever printer I'm working on. That's mostly because of the videos so that I can share them with you. You don't have to do this, but I think it's handy to keep versions, whichever ones you want to alter, just so it keeps them separate. So 2.1 is my base version. That's been untouched. I made a copy of that, and I'm going to name this one Ender 3 underscore V2. Now I have an older version of the V2, but we want to start from scratch. This version hasn't been altered at all yet. So we'll open that up, and we'll head into the Marlin folder. We have a configuration.h and adv.h, again, that haven't been altered. But we want to use our example version. So I'm going to open up another file explorer. And I've already extracted it, but this is our configurations release for 2.1. This is all your examples. We'll open that up. Go to config, examples, Creality. And there's a version in here for Ender 3 V2. They even have a version if you'd like to use the E3 Turbo or the Mini E3 version 3. We are going to stick with the Creality version 2.2.2 for now. Note there are files for the screen in here, but we'll come back to that in a moment. We're just concerned with the firmware on the main board at this point. So we'll go into V2.2.2, and I'm going to go with the one that has the Marlin UI. Again, you'll see more on the screen here in a moment. But we're going to stick with that. We're going to copy these configuration files. We'll just copy them, and we'll paste them right here. And we're going to overwrite the default ones, so just hit replace. Now we have a version that's tailored towards the V2. It won't take much altering at all to get it working on our printer. Also note, if you use something like OneDrive to synchronize your files, you might want to do this ahead of time and let OneDrive do its thing. Before you open it up in Visual Studio Code like we're getting ready to do, if all the files aren't there, if they're in the middle of doing a sync, it might cause problems. So let all of those bake, let them get synced, and then come back. It's a great time for a cup of coffee. Once we have our example overlaid, we're going to head to Visual Studio Code. VScode is what I like to call it. I have a video on how to set all this up. It will be in the description. But from the File Explorer tab up here, we're just going to hit Open Folder. We'll head to Downloads, into our Marlin 2.1 folder. We'll open up the one we just made, Ender 3 V2, and you can see it contains the Marlin folder. You want to open the folder that contains the Marlin folder inside VScode. So we're going to jump back one level, highlight this guy, and hit Add. It's going to start populating it with Platform.io. If you've done it correctly, you should see a .pio and a .vscode folder up in here. You also want the Marlin extension. You can install that. Just go to the Extensions tab. That is in the VScode setup video. That takes a lot of the guesswork out of compiling for different boards. But for now, let's expand Marlin. And we'll open up configuration.h. And the configuration file, again, is already ready to go for your Ender 3 V2 if you haven't made any modifications. If you have, now's the great time to go ahead and update your E-steps maybe, if you've changed your extruder, whatever it might be. We do have a BL Touch, so we'll have to change it a bit. But just go ahead and search for Ender. You can do a Control F, and you'll get down to Ender 3 V2 OEM Display. And by default, it uses Marlin in Landscape. So you could actually take the screen, flip it on its side, and use it that way. But there's all kinds of different options for using this screen. For the first go around, we're going to do this a couple of times. I'm going to comment out the Marlin landscape, and let's just go with the Creality LCD, the first one here, just so we can check them out side by side. But you even have options to go ahead and use Pro UI, you might have seen that before, and the Jacob Myers version. I've seen other videos on that as well. Or just regular Marlin and Portrait. We're going to take a look at all of these. But before we do that, we do have to get set up for our BL Touch. So let's just search BL Touch. With this default version we're using, we're just going to uncomment BL Touch. We have to scroll up just a little bit because they do allow you to probe manually in this config. You can only have one, so we'll comment this out. Now remember, when we did the BL Touch, we did remove the Z minimum end stop. We're using the BL Touch as our end stop at this moment. On this board, the Creality 422, they have a set of probe pins, but they also have a Z minimum end stop pin that we're no longer using. So we need to alter the configuration to make that work. So by default, you have Z-min probe uses Z-min end stop pin. We're going to comment that out because we're going to use a different pin for that probe for the Z-min end stop. We're also going to take the comment off of use probe for Z homing. We are going to use Z safe homing as well, but this is good to enable so it always knows that it's going to use that probe to home with, like we're doing here. And then down a bit, we need to tell it what pin this probe is using for its Z-min end stop. So we'll take the comment off of this line. By default, for ramps, it's set to 32. But if you need to know your probe pin, which one this board is using, you can just go into the configuration and find it. So we'll go to the pins file. We'll open up source, go to pins, and then you need to know the processor that you have. The 422 board does use a STM32, and it is an F103, I believe. It doesn't matter, all the F1 families should be the same, so you can expand that one. And there is a Creality version 422 file. But if you open that up, there's not much in here, because most of these boards share the same pins. So you're going to have some includes. So we really want to look at the pins Creality V4H. And it's up here at the top. If you scroll through here, you're going to find the pin you want to use. You can see it's well-defined Z-min probe pin. There's even a comment out here that it's the BL Touch in pin. So it's PB1. That's the pin on that probe pin on the board that you saw in the last video that you're going to want to use. So back to configuration.h. For that zmin probe pin, just type in PB1. That way, the firmware will know which pin gets triggered when your Z in-stop is triggered. And we can keep moving down the config. If we scroll down a little bit further, we will need to set those offsets, just like we did in the last video. Remember, we are to the left and to the front of the nozzle with our probe, so we're going to do a -50, and I measured it at about a -8 in Y. We already had our Z offset, so I'm just going to mirror that. It was a -3.17. If you haven't calibrated that yet, go back to the previous video. You can do it on the fly. It's no big deal. Auto bed leveling by linear should already be set because they did have manual probing on. And you can go ahead and update your grid points if you want to. We're doing currently 3x3. It's a 9-point grid. I'm okay with that for now. A lot of people like to do 7 for 49 points. And we're also going to take the comment off of Z-safe homing. I usually don't use Z-safe homing, but on a printer like this where your probe is out to the left of the hot end, it's off the bed when you try to home Z. So you want it to home in the center. That's what this option will do for you. So we definitely want that on this printer. I'll also go ahead and update my filament settings for PLA and ABS. And make the usual updates like I do. Like with nozzle park, I like it to the front right. So if that's where you want it, this is what it would look like. And just looking through, everything else should stay exactly the same as what it was in the example. Mostly it was just stuff to get our BL Touch working. From here we can save this. We can head to our Marlin extension and hit the build hammer. It's going to pull in all the boards that this board could be. Most of the time, the first option here is going to work. Again, this is the 422 version. So we'll just hit build. Now, depending on the screen that you choose, you might get some errors because some screen UI versions aren't going to support some features. Remember, we selected that default Creality LCD UI. It doesn't allow LCD bed tramming. So we can just take that feature out. So anything it's complaining about, LCD bed leveling, bed tramming, you can just go to configuration.h and search for that. Here's LCD bed leveling. We'll just comment that out. And right below, bed tramming. We'll comment that out. Now, for the different UIs, if you want to use something like this, come back and try it again in a different version. It might work there. But depending on the version you use, you might have to lose a feature here and there. So we'll go ahead and build again. So the compile was successful. Just doing those few tweaks allowed us to compile with that UI. Now, I just wanted to do that to show you the error and make sure that we had a successful compile. I do want to make a couple of other quick changes. So back to the File Explorer up here, we're going to go ahead and look at configuration_adv.h. And I'm just going to search for advance because linear advance is not enabled by default. If I want to use that, I want to be able to. So we're going to take the comment off of linear advance and I'm going to set the K value to 0. Remember, you have to calibrate linear advance, but it will be enabled if you'd like to use it. And then the other thing we need is the advanced pause feature. We're going to enable that. This will allow you to do things like M600 or pause the printer and change the filament, and it's going to do a sequence to enable you to load that filament or back it out, whatever you might need to do. I did update all the values for advanced pause to use an Ender 3. It's going to be pretty close as long as you have around the same length of Bowden tube. If you'd like to try my config, it'll be available in the description. So those are pretty much the only two things that I'd like to add. We should be able to go ahead and build again and then load it up on the printer. Marlin, build, build. One error I should have remembered that we did not too long ago is that now if you use linear advance, if your jerk is less than 10, it's going to throw an error. There is a way to get around that. You can do it in linear advance if you'd like. Allow low e-jerk levels. I'm going to go that route this time because usually I set the jerk value in the slicer anyway. So just note there's more than one way to get around the error. You can either adjust jerk or go this route. I just thought that'd be worth mentioning in case somebody else hits it. So we'll build again. So the build was successful that time. We're ready to load the bin file on our SD card. There is one thing I wanted to mention before that about SD cards. When I was doing some of the testing for this video, I was using a 32 gig card. And I was having problems with the screen and the board picking up that bin file. I switched to this cheaper 8 gig card and it works just fine. So if you're having problems, switch out your SD card just to give it a check. But our SD card is loaded, ready to go. We want to make sure it's FAT32. We'll do a quick format. And then here in the Marlin extension, you can go directly to your firmware. Just click under here in the blue. Now for this Creality board, it doesn't really matter what it's named, just as long as it wasn't the same as last time. And Marlin has done a good job with this because they've put a date and a timestamp on it. So you're never going to have the same one twice. So you can just copy this one. Don't even have to change the name for this printer. Paste it on your SD card, and then you're ready to go ahead and load it on the printer. Then we'll just load the SD card in the slot here on the board. And we can power up. Our firmware flashed, we have booted up, but you'll notice something isn't quite right here. Remember, we did go with the Creality UI version in Marlin, but the words are off. It just doesn't look quite right. If you go to Info, it does say we're using firmware version 2.1, but definitely a few bugs here and there. And that's because the firmware on the screen has to match what you're using on the board. And depending on which UI you use, it's going to be just a little bit different. But Marlin has you covered. So we'll just update to the DWin set that Marlin suggests. So we'll go ahead and power down. The screen is just on 2 pins. You can just slide it up and it'll come off. You can take out the plug, and then you have 4 3mm screws you need to pull off of there. The back of that screen bezel just pulls off, and you have an SD card slot. That's where we're going to load the firmware. And we're just going to use the same SD card that we're using to load the board firmware. It shouldn't matter at all. It's a different set. So back to our configuration examples like I was showing you before, where we got our V2 files. Configurations. We'll go into Config Examples Creality, and then back to that Ender 3 V2. You can see we have those LCD files like I was showing you before. Everything in this DWin set should work for all of the different UI versions that you want to use with Marlin. So just take this whole folder, right click and copy it, and put that on your SD card. Now we can take our SD card, load it onto our screen, just plug it back in for now because we'll want to get that SD card back out of there, and boot up. When it's flashing the screen firmware, it's going to be blue. When it's done, it's going to turn bright orange. It only takes a couple of seconds. Now we're orange. We can turn the printer off, remove the SD card, and let's just turn it back on for a quick test. And now with that new DWin set, all that craziness we saw before with the Creality UI is gone. Everything's working as expected. And to run Marlin and all the different UIs, that's really all we have to do. That's all the firmware we're going to have to flash to the screen. So we can go ahead and power off and put our screen case back together. And I wanted to make that just a little bit more up front. There's a lot of great UI versions for the Ender 3 V2 that utilize this screen. What Marlin has done is tried their best to go with one DWin set that will work with all of the different feature sets that you can use. They're not going to have the flashy look of something like the Pro UI with all the different icons, but it will have all the features that it includes and try to get the layout just right like you would see on one of those UIs. So I just wanted to make that a little bit more apparent. It might not have the same look or feel, but all the features will be there. So now back to Marlin for the fun part. We saw that DWin Creality LCD set. That's the one that we just loaded up. It's the default one, but it's cleaned up for this version of Marlin. But you can also do all of these other ones. The Pro UI, the Jacob Myers version, the Marlin UI in Portrait and Landscape. So you can even change the direction of the screen and how it's mounted if you really felt like it. Now basically, these are just going to be different feature sets, especially with Pro UI and the Jacob Myers version. It's just going to give you a compilation of all the features that these two versions have, not necessarily what it's going to look like. So for this example, let's just say that we don't want to use the Creality LCD version. We like Pro UI and all the feature sets that it has. Again, you're not going to look exactly the same, but you're going to get the same type of feature list if you're used to using Pro UI. Maybe you just want to go back to stock Marlin because it might be a little easier to alter. We'll just uncomment Pro UI, recompile, and upload it to the printer. So when it's done compiling, you don't even need this dwin set any longer. That was just for the screen. We just updated with our newest bin file onto our SD card, and then we can take it to the printer. And just to be clear, we're just dealing with the firmware that's on the board. We don't have to update anything on the screen again. We'll power up. And you can see now that we've switched UI versions over to Pro UI, it's a little cleaner, it looks a little different, but pretty similar to the stock Creality one that we were on before, but now you have all these added features. So if you go into Advanced, for example, there's a whole lot more stuff that you can do with this version, including changing all of the colors of the screen. You can change it up, all kinds of different stuff in here. It even has some diag, which is cool to see. This would be something like an M119 command. You can do it right from the screen with this version. Now, we're not going to go over every feature that this screen has. It's got pretty much any one that you'd ever want, but I do like one the most over all the others, and that's in-mesh leveling. You can use this screen and its color capability to see what the mesh looks like. So all you got to do is auto build mesh. It's going to run a G29 command. And when it's done, you get this really colorful readout trying to give you an idea of where your mesh is. You can see red over here, we have a 0.03 difference. Up here in the front, we've got a green one, a 0.01. And having these features right here on the screen, a lot of them will actually take the place of things like Octoprint, something like Bed Visualizer. Of course, it's not as robust, but at least you have it right here on your printer. That's pretty cool. So both the Pro UI and the Jacob Myers version are great options, have a lot of great features. But of course, I can't do this video on Marlin and not use the Marlin version. So we'll go with the Marlin UI Portrait, so we can just leave the stock mounting on our screen. Let's check that out. So I've got the Marlin UI version on the SD card. Let's power up. And after the update's complete, we get the most awesome Marlin logo in full color and the classic Marlin UI. I just can't get enough of this screen. It's clean. I like what they've done with the font. Plus, it's just like the old school 2004, taking it just a little bit retro. It's hard to believe I just said retro on a 3D printer. But let's ignore that. When you head in, it's all the classic options, motion, temperature, configuration. Everything is here as you knew it before. If you're a classic Marlin user, it's going to be exactly the same. Plus, it has a really nice, clean look. And everything in the Marlin firmware is going to act the exact same way. Now you just have the option to be able to update the UI with whatever feature set you'd like to use. Of course, I'm a little partial to the Marlin version. But even with slicing, we talked about it in the BL Touch video we did recently. It's going to work exactly the same because it's just stock Marlin. We had to add some commands in our start and stop G-code before. You would do the same thing with any other Marlin version. And just to touch on that same information again, if you want to do that auto level before every print, here's your start G-code. This is Prusa Slicer. You can just put your G29 right here. You can also use the same mesh over and over if you wish with the M420 commands. Same exact thing for things like Linear Advance. In Prusa Slicer, you can actually do it in your filament G-code. Since filament is going to change the Linear Advance value, I would put it in here. It's going to be different for PETG than it is for PLA. So there it is. We have upgraded our Creality Ender 3 V2 to the newest version of Marlin Firmware 2.1, and we can be ensured that all of the safety features are intact. And you can continue to use all the amazing features that Marlin Firmware has to make your 3D printer even better. So hopefully you found this helpful in hacking or modifying your Ender 3 V2. That is it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.